Welcome to the City Serve podcast. City Serve's mission is to empower the local church to be a catalyst for life and community transformation. City Serve's mission, as you know, as we empower the churches, we have a supply chain. Many of the resources, goods in kind, and food, and any of the other resources, many of you have already taken advantage of. But also what we talk about, that maybe not as much, even though when you're onboarding, we talk about Isaiah 58. Lean into brokenness, and that template for us is those 10 initiatives. This podcast, and throughout this, we want to talk a lot about, unpack how those initiatives can help you, God's people, your church, to be involved. So it's my privilege here to introduce to you Kyle Johnson, Director of Compassion Initiatives.
Well, hello, and welcome to the brand new, the first ever City Serve Compassion Initiatives podcast. I'm your host, Kyle Johnson, and a couple of things. What we're praying that God does through this podcast is really encourage you and His people, the church, to begin to engage people in their communities through compassion evangelism. What we want to do is every single month we want to highlight one of our compassion initiatives here at City Serve. And we want to do that to encourage you, pastors, churches, and those of you who are lay people just attending and ready and willing to serve. We hope that this podcast serves as an encouragement to you. But what we want to provide is real, practical examples of how you can begin to immediately, no matter where you're at, begin to engage people in your community through compassion evangelism. I am so excited to have on this journey my friend and really a hero of mine, a co-host that I love dearly. And he's the man, the myth, the legend, Steve Kramer. Steve, you have served, you've done a number of things, but most recently you've served as a missionary, you and Julie and your awesome kids, to the Netherlands. And you have an unbelievable story of how God has used you. And we're going to hear more about that next month, because most recently your role, what you are doing, is you serve nationally as the director of the Vulnerable Initiative. Steve, it's great to have you, man.
Hey, it's great to be here. I'll tell you what, Kyle, I love what God is doing through these compassion initiatives. It's just absolutely incredible to see people get a heart for God's mission and then be resourced and then out into the mission field. And we have a wonderful guest with us today, Cheryl Giesbrecht Turner, and you're an accomplished author, a speaker, ministry leader. You've done a lot of things in your life. And when I talk to you, though, the thing that really impacts me is that you've allowed God to use all of your story for His glory. And so would you share with us today why the Widow Initiative is dear to your heart?
It wasn't my plan. Thanks, guys, for having me on, too. But it wasn't my plan when God allowed me to take a detour through understanding what it meant to be a widow. My first husband was a pastor, and we were married for 28 years. In fact, we had a bright future ahead of us. And the day that he was promoted to heaven, if you will, I had led a women's retreat at a local camp, and he was an avid motorcycle rider. I had driven our car up there that day, and we had walked around and made a lot of plans for 2 to 3 hours after the women's retreat group left. It was, we were thinking about all the things that we, as you know, when you're married, you want to make plans, and you're praying through, what is God going to do next? Because we were empty nesters and very excited about the new beginning. So things really changed for me when he got on his motorcycle, I got in my car, and then less than 5 minutes later, he was out of my sight. We were heading down to Casa Munoz for dinner that night, and I was driving home, and 5 minutes after he had left my sight, I noticed that there was a motorcycle on the side of the road. I flipped my car around, and I realized it was his bike.
Wow.
And I couldn't find him. He had flipped his bike. We don't know what happened, but the events that happened within the 5 minutes that he was out of my sight, it took his life. Ultimately, the Lord took him home. Mm-hmm. So that day was October 17th, 2009. And that was the day that I had to really decide, did God love me, even though his plans were different than what I had thought they would be. And so I really had to do a lot of not only soul searching, but let God love me through the next few months. Engaged in a lot of trauma counseling, looked at God's word, had some widow friends, women friends who really embraced me as a new single woman, got really busy in ministries and jobs. But ultimately, it helped me understand how God, in the middle of a situation that it really seemed unfair, it was unplanned, obviously, but it was also very untimely because Pastor Paul was only 52 years old. So obviously, he was very young. And so I wondered, and I asked God, where do I go from here? I didn't feel it was my right to ask God why. My right and my honor and my responsibility really was to ask God how. How should I get through? How are you going to walk with me through this? And so that's what I did.
Wow.
Powerful. It's one thing to go through that yourself, but then what you've done is you've taken that experience and you've turned it into ministry opportunity to bless others. Help us understand a little bit how that looked in that journey.
You know, one thing that you have learned, I know both of you know this for a fact, is that often the experiences that God takes you through are points of contact, points of relation for other people. And so I was also a recovered drug addict. I was a juvenile delinquent. So that was one of the connecting points. But then it was 2004, I was diagnosed with stage 4 cancer and recovered from that. So understood about being a patient, being told where to go, doctor's appointments, chemotherapy, side effects. God healed me. And then it was 5 years after that when Pastor Paul died. So I thought to myself, okay, here I am, a widow. I want to relate to other women. I want to understand what they're going through. But in order to do that, I knew that I had to get the healing that God promised me. Yeah. And so there were lots of different opportunities for me to do that. One of the ones that I've shared is Grief Share. I thought to myself, there's no way that I want to do that because I thought my experience was so sacred, and it wasn't that I thought it was any less meaningful to me, but I wondered if I shared it with someone else, if it would be less honoring to Paul or something. So but I decided to go to Grief Share, and I did, and so now I facilitate that class at the mission at Kern County. And there are so many of the women who are in the treatment facility. We're on probably, I think it's our 8th year there, and it's a regular class that we do once a year. And there are women who not only have lost someone through a drug overdose, through a murder that they've witnessed, a mother who has passed away from cancer or natural causes. But the connecting point for them is that they are in recovery, but they don't know what to do with their losses.
Well, you had mentioned, and I'm just curious to know, Cheryl, the Grief Share class that you oversee, that you facilitate, are the majority of people in that class widows or widowers, or is it a good mix of both?
Some of them are. Some of the ladies are widowers and widows, but for the most part, they're mothers, or they are probably more like they want to know how to help someone else or how to help themselves through a loss. So the widows that I deal with now are more friends that I invite to join me in the Grief Share group. We have a group of women at Canyon Hills that I usually will visit a widow. In fact, there was different people that come to me. People send them to me. I'm one of the female counselors at Canyon Hills. So often Velma Smith will refer me someone that she knows is a widow. So in fact, I just met with someone yesterday who had been widowed 18 years ago, and she was still organizing her life after that.
Wow.
Yeah.
And so one of the things about that is to be willing to pray and ask God, so what do I have that they need? And it's really what God has, but it's through the filter of my experiences that I can say to that widow and then some of the other ones that God has everything you need.
That's so good. Yeah, there's no timetable to grief.
Yeah.
It's a process, and we all grieve differently. And I wonder, you obviously did not expect to lose your husband
Right.
so early.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering if there's someone that's watching this, that's listening to this, or maybe they know someone who is a young widow, it's never expected, really, right?
No.
But is there something that you would say to them to either encourage them or how they can encourage that person who's recently lost their loved one?
What a great question. Thank you for asking that. I was just sharing this with our group a couple of weeks ago so once I was alone in our family home. It was about 2 weeks after the services, and we had a house full of people that were comforting me and my children, but my children were adults when Paul was killed, so they both went back to their homes. So I was there alone in my house, and I prayed, Lord, I feel so alone. I feel this house is empty, but I know that you are real. You are here for me. I just need to feel your presence. And he showed me that in so many ways. He was a husband. It was, I said I was working 2 jobs, and that was partially because I was wanting to fill up my time and, of course, needed money. Didn't plan on having to work that much, but I was grateful for the opportunities. It wasn't that I was trying to run away from my pain, but it was kind of a survival mode for my finances, and I know many can relate to that as well. But when I chose to let God be my husband, then when God gave me about 7 years, it was probably 4 years later, an opportunity to enter into a relationship with a new husband, it was really a switch. I thought, well, Lord, how can this be? You're already my husband.
Yeah.
And why would I want, a real husband again? I've already been married. I'm not sure that I really wasn't sure about that. However, it worked out, and now I've been happily married for almost 8 years to my second husband, Dr. Jim Turner. So,
That's awesome. That's awesome.
but he is a very real husband, El Shaddai,
Yeah.
the God who is enough.
That's so good. That is so good. Hey, the purpose of this podcast primarily is to encourage ministry leaders, to encourage anybody in the church and pastors. So this month we're highlighting the widow. What are some practical kind of next steps that people can take to begin to engage and minister to the widow in their community? Because Steve, you and I were talking about it, and the reality is a lot of churches are not doing anything for the widow, for the widower. And I'd like to believe, and I do believe, that it's not because they don't care. Where do you start? How do you begin the process of exploring what can we do as a church to reach those people in our community? What would you tell those listening as far as next steps?
I think for pastors, for senior pastors especially, I know it's really hard to have time for widows. To be a good listener is really key. And then to be available. And that doesn't mean that you go over to their home and help them fix their plumbing at any time of the night. No, that's not it. It's about being able to help them connect with those that can do that. But I think what a widow needs is to feel heard. And it's like when you feel so traumatized when you have a loss like a husband or a wife, you feel like nobody really understands. And even if that person even if that person doesn't understand, for them to listen. And so here, how counseling skills, I hear you say that, you really miss them. And not to try to rush them through it. That is something in our churches, I really feel it's a huge void. We don't teach people about grief. Grief is so common, in foreign countries. Both of you have traveled extensively. So when I've gone to Africa, grief is taught because The body stays in the home for up to 2 months after. The children come and they see, the grandfather or the grandmother, and it's a part of their lives. So they understand, okay, grandma isn't with us anymore because their soul is in heaven with Jesus. And so it's explained, and it's a natural part of life. So I think if we could even take time to get proper training, offer more tools, and I'll share some of those in a few minutes. I think a real key thing for me, because of people that told me that they would be there for us, for me and my kids, even though my kids were adults, people that said that they would do something but didn't, I think follow through is a real important thing too.
Yeah.
So that number one, listen
That's
well,
good.
don't give advice. Number two, follow through. When you say that you'll be there, choose to enter their pain. And some of that is not saying, oh, I wish you were through this, or it's been now a year, it's been 6 weeks, shouldn't you be farther along? It's our grief. We can grieve as long as we need to. Of course, if somebody's stuck in that, you want to encourage them to do something about it. And anyway, then number three, connect widows with other widows. And that is a real key thing that we do at Canyon Hills. We have widows groups. But I also understand that widows don't need to feel like they have a disease. I think it's really a healthy thing if we were to include more groups for even divorced people. There's so many divorced people at our churches, and widows too, and include them as, it's a married folks church. Sorry, but I found that out when I was single. Yeah. And I was asking at my church, it wasn't Canyon Hills, it was a different ministry, and I would ask them for 18 months if I could get into a small group. And it wasn't until I started dating someone that they put me in a small group.
Wow.
So I will tell you, I'm sorry to say that, but I thought that some of it was people might have thought I was after their husband. That wasn't my thing. I wanted to be in a small group because that's where I could do life with people who cared about me and my needs. They weren't going to try and fix me. I just wanted to be heard. Okay. The fourth thing is to encourage anyone who's a widow or widower to keep moving forward. If you understand, or you see someone who, like for me, people would ask me, are you drinking? Because they knew my past. They knew that was one of my ways of coping in the past. Even as an adult pastor's wife, yes, I can say that was one of my coping mechanisms. It hasn't been for quite a long time, but they would call me on it. Keep people moving forward in their grief. Support systems are so important. Yeah. And whatever those look like, it's not about sitting there and saying, here's my story, do you think you can top it? No, it's about, we believe that God has a plan for this, and not saying you're doing anything wrong, but we want you to experience the total freedom in Christ that he promises us.
Amen.
His abundant life is even for widows, even for widowers.
That's good.
In the midst of all of it, we can find the freedom and hope and the healing. God says, I bind up broken hearts. I heal wounds. But if we don't bring our wounds to him, if we don't bring our grief and all of the disappointments, the life that we had planned that turned out differently, if we don't bring all that to God, he can't help us.
Oh, that's good.
We have to be honest.
That's so good. You have real practical tools for any pastor that's watching. And Cheryl, I want to thank you so much for being our first guest of this podcast that we are kicking off. And again, the desire, the heart behind it is to put tools in the hands of pastors and leaders to begin effective compassion evangelism to the widow, to the orphan, the other initiatives that we will be highlighting in the coming months. So thank you so much for being here. We're going to share your info.
Thank you.
We're going to share your information because you have a website
Yes.
that would be a great asset and benefit to any pastor that's just wanting to begin that exploration process.
Wonderful.
What can we do to reach the widow? Because, Pastor, I can tell you, whether you're doing something or not, they are in your community. They are attending your church. And James chapter 1, it's pretty clear, isn't it? The pure, undefiled religion that's pleasing before God the Father is to minister to the orphan and to the widow. And so thank you for being here and sharing your knowledge, your experience with us. we are excited about this podcast, Steve.
Yeah, it's going to be a great time.
We're going to talk to you next month as we highlight the Vulnerable Initiative, and it's going to be so good. But I want to thank you for my co-host, Steve Kramer. I'm Kyle Johnson. We just want to thank you for tuning in to the Compassion Initiative podcast, and we hope to see you next month as we highlight the vulnerable. God bless you, and we'll see you soon.